Chapter 17 Typhoon. All day, under a gyrating sky, Louis and Phil rode the swells, feeling a wary thrill as the island peeked into view. Slowly, it became distinct. They saw a bright white line where waves dashed against a beach or reef. That afternoon, one island became two, then many. Overhead, a colossal storm was gathering. The men rowed landward. The sky broke, a slashing rain came down, and the islands vanished. The ocean began heaving, and wind sent the raft spinning up swells, perhaps 40 feet, then careening down into troughs as deep as canyons. Phil and Louis were in a typhoon. Wave after wave slammed into the raft, tipping it sideways and peeling it upward. To stop it from flipping, Louis and Phil bailed in water to weigh it down, sat on opposite sides to balance their weight, and lay down gravity low. They held on. Night fell and the storm pounded. The raft raced over hundreds of mountains of water. At times, the men felt themselves flying in the darkness as the raft was swept in the air. Louis felt even more intensely afraid than he'd felt as the Green Hornet was following. They thought of the land they could no longer see, fearing that any second they'd be flung into a reef. Sometime in the night, the storm died away. In its wake came the sweet soil, greenness, rain washing over the scent of land. As dawn neared, the men heard the hiss of water scouring a reef. Exhausted, they took turns napping, with one man on the lookout for land. Somewhere along the way, they both fell asleep. They woke in a new universe. After weeks in open ocean, they were surrounded by islands. On one, they saw a deserted native village. They had heard of the Japanese capturing and shipping out natives as slaves and wondered if that had happened here. They began rowing for shore. Louis had predicted they'd find land on the 47th day. Phil had chosen the 46th. Because they spotted land on the 46th and were reaching it on the 47th, they decided they both been right. Louis gazed at a tiny island with one tree on it. A strange thing happened. The tree became two trees. After a moment's confusion, he suddenly understood. It wasn't an island. Those weren't trees. It was a boat. It had been perpendicular to them, leaving only one mast visible, and then it turned, bringing the rearward mast into view. Louis and Phil ducked and rowed as fast as they could, trying to get ashore before they were spotted. They were too late. The boat sped toward them. Louis and Phil rowed hard, but the boat caught them and drew raft. Along the decks of Japanese men, aiming guns at Louis and Phil. A sailor threw a rope, and Louis caught it. He and Phil could climb up to the boat, but their legs were too weak. The sailors tied them to a rope and ladder and dragged them up. On the deck, Louis and Phil tried to rise, but their legs buckled. With the sailors hurting them, they crawled to the mast. The sailors lashed them to it and bound their hands behind them. A sailor spoke to them in Japanese, apparently asking questions. Bayonet past Louis's face, trying to hack off his beard. One cracked a pistol into Phil's jaw, then moved to do the same to Louis. Louis tipped his head forward. Then, when the sailor swung, jerked his head back. He made the man miss, but smacked against the mast. The captain chastised the crewmen. The mood changed. Louis and Phil untied, and they were given water and 2 biscuits. Slowly, savoring each crumb. It was his first food in 8 days. Louis and Phil were transferred to a second boat, where a crewman fed them more biscuits and some coconut. A man approached, Japanese-English dictionary in hand, and asked questions of their journey. The boat drew up to an island. Louis and Phil were blindfolded, and men half carried them off the boat. After a few minutes, Louis felt himself being laid down on something soft. His blindfold was removed. He and Phil were in an infirmary, lying on beds. Through a window, he saw Japanese soldiers thrusting bayonets into dummies. An officer spoke to the Japanese surrounding the castaways, then spoke in English, apparently repeating himself so Louis and Phil would understand. "These are American flyers," he said. "Treat them gently." A doctor came in, smiled, examined Phil and Louis, and smoothed ointment on their salt sores. Louis and Phil took turns standing on a scale, each with a man ready to legs failed. Phil, who'd weighed about 150 pounds when he'd stepped aboard the Hornet, now weighed about 80 pounds. By different accounts, 5 foot 10-inch Louis, who'd weighed about 160 before the crash, weighed 67 pounds, 79 and one half pounds, or even 87 pounds. The doctor had cognac, eggs, ham, milk, fresh bread, and fruit salad brought in. Louis and Phil feasted. When they were done, they were seated before Japanese officers who gaped at the shrunken yellow men. An officer asked how they ended up there. Louis told the story as the officers listened, fascinated. Louis and Phil knew it had begun, but didn't know where it had ended. The officer, they were in the Marshall Islands. They drifted 2 miles. 2 beds were made up, and the castaways were invited to rest. Slipping between cool, clean sheets, their stomachs full, their sores soothed, they were deeply grateful. Phil had a relieved thought. They are our friends. Louis infirmary for 2 days, attended by a kind Japanese. The third day, an officer came, bearing beef, chocolate, coconut, and news. They were being taken to another atoll. The name he gave sent a tremor through Louis. Kwajalein. It was the place known as Execution Island. After you leave here, the officer said, we cannot guarantee your life. Aboard the freighter, Louis and Phil were treated well, but as Kwajalein, the Japanese suddenly became harsh. On came the boats, and Louis and Phil were carried ashore and dumped on a hard surface. When Louis said something to Phil, a boot kicked him as a voice shouted, "No!" An engine started, and they were moving. They were on a truck. In a few minutes, the truck stopped, and Louis was tugged out and carried again. There was walking, a darkening, and the feeling of being thrown backward. Louis's back struck a wall, and he fell to the floor. Someone yanked off his blindfold. A door slammed, a lock turned. At first, Louis could barely see. His eyes darted about uncontrollably. His mind raced, flitting wildly from thought to thought. After weeks of endless openness, he was disoriented by the compression of space around him. Slowly, his thoughts quieted and his eyes settled. He was in a cell about the length of his body and a little wider than his shoulders. There was a small window in the door. The floor was strewn with gravel, dirt, and maggots, and the room hummed with flies and mosquitoes, already swarming on him. There was a hole in the floor with a latrine bucket below it. The air hung scorching hot and still, heavy with the stench of human waste. Louis looked up. In the dimness, he saw words carved in the wall. 9 Marines marooned on Makin Island, August 12, 1942. Below were 9 names. In August 1942, after an American raid on a Japanese base at Makin in the Marshall Islands, 9 Marines had been mistakenly left behind, captured by the Japanese. They disappeared. Louis was almost certainly the first American to learn they had been taken to Kwajalein, but they weren't here now. Louis felt a wave of foreboding. He called to Phil. Phil's voice unanswered, distant and small. He was down the hall in a squalid hole just like Louis's. Each asked the other if he was okay. They knew it was likely the last time they'd talk, but if they wished to say goodbye, neither had the chance. There was shuffling in the corridor as a guard took up his station. Louis and Phil went quiet. Louis looked down at his body. Legs that had sprung through a 412 mile on that last Hawaiian morning were now useless. His vibrant body had shrunken until only the bones remained, draped in yellow skin, crawling with parasites. All I see, he thought, is a dead body breathing. He dissolved into hard, racking weeping. He muffled his sobs so the guard wouldn't hear him. All right, that's the end of part 3. So we'll get to chapter 18 in